Long before the world knew him as Cudjo Lewis, before America tried to silence his story and pretend he never existed, he was a young man named Oluwale Kosola, living in a thriving West African community that few history books ever bothered to describe. His homeland was not a place of dust and poverty, but a structured, multilingual society filled with traditions, music, and family bonds that stretched across generations. Kosola was born around 1841 in the Bante region of what is now Benin. His childhood was marked by rituals that connected young people to their elders, ceremonies to honor ancestors, and the expectation that he would one day become a respected member of his community. He grew up surrounded by brothers, cousins, and clan members who shared a deep sense of identity, one that would later be ripped apart without warning. To understand the significance of his journey, it is necessary to begin in a world that was not defined by enslavement. His people were farmers, hunters, spiritual practitioners, and storytellers. Every evening, families gathered around fires where elders recited oral history that had been preserved for centuries. These stories shaped Kosola's identity far more deeply than the English language he would eventually be forced to learn. His earliest memories were of communal living, traditional dances, and the apprenticeships that prepared young men to take on adult responsibilities. He had never heard of Alabama, never imagined the vast ocean he would later cross, and never dreamed that foreign traders thousands of miles away had already placed a price on his freedom. But the mid-19th century was a time of immense turmoil in West Africa, a period when the powerful Dahomey kingdom conducted devastating raids on smaller towns and villages. These raids were driven in part by warfare traditions, but increasingly fueled by the transatlantic slave trade, which, although officially outlawed by most Western nations, continued illegally through covert arrangements with American traders who were willing to break the law for profit. One such trader was Timothy Maher of Mobile, Alabama, who boldly bet that he could smuggle enslaved Africans into the United States long after it had been banned. To fulfill his reckless wager, he arranged for a ship, the Clotilda, to sail across the Atlantic and return with human cargo. The violence that upended Kosola's life began with that wager. The day the raiders came, he was still young, full of plans for adulthood, surrounded by family, and unprepared for the terror that arrived with the Dahomey warriors. Survivors would later describe how the sky seemed to shake with the drums of invaders, how warriors swept through villages with fire and weaponry, taking captives and killing those who resisted. For Kosola, it was the moment his world shattered. He saw relatives slaughtered, homes set ablaze, and the life he knew reduced to chaos. As he and other villagers were bound, dragged away, and forced into captivity, he had no way of knowing that he was about to become part of one of the final and most illegal slave voyages in American history. The march toward the coast was brutal. Captives were pushed through forests and over rivers, often with little food or rest. The younger and stronger they were, the more valuable they became to the slave traders waiting at ports. Kosola, still healthy and resilient, was among the most desirable captives, an irony that sealed his fate. When he reached the coastal slave forts, he encountered a world unlike anything he had seen, crowded pens filled with terrified people from different regions, shackled together and stripped of identity. Language barriers made communication difficult, yet the shared fear united them. He later described in interviews the horror of seeing people sold like goats, a memory that stayed with him for the rest of his long life. As the captives were transferred to the Clotilda, many of them realized for the first time that they were leaving Africa. The ship, small and designed to conceal its illicit mission, was packed tightly with more than 100 young Africans forced aboard under cover of night. The conditions were suffocating. Shackled in the hold, they endured a journey across the Atlantic that lasted weeks in darkness, fear, sickness, and despair. The captives had never imagined a world beyond their homeland, and the forced crossing of the ocean felt like entering the realm of the dead. Many prayed to their ancestors, believing they might never see land again. Cudjo later spoke of the Middle Passage with a mixture of trauma and clarity. He remembered the stench of the ship, the way people cried out in languages he didn't recognize, and how survival depended on endurance more than strength. He recalled how some captives died from illness or heartbreak, their bodies thrown overboard without ceremony. For those who survived, including Kosola, every moment was marked by uncertainty. The crew gave them minimal food, only enough to keep them alive, and no compassion. The voyage represented one of the last illegal transatlantic slave crossings, conducted in secrecy yet inflicted with the same cruelty that defined centuries of trafficking. The Clotilda reached the United States in 1860, landing near Mobile, Alabama. Because the international slave trade had been outlawed since 1808, the ship's owners took extraordinary measures to conceal their crime. Under the cover of darkness, they transferred the captives to a riverboat and hid them in the swamps along the Mobile Tensaw Delta. The Clotilda itself was burned and sunk, deliberately destroyed to erase evidence. The Africans, meanwhile, were divided among various buyers who had been part of the arrangement. Mayer claimed some for himself, others went to members of his network. Cossola was among those distributed like contraband, stripped of name and identity in the eyes of the law. In that moment, his transformation into Cudjo Lewis began, not because he chose the name, but because it was imposed upon him by his enslavers. He was told he was no longer Oluwale Cossola, no longer the son of his parents, no longer a member of his people, but inside himself he carried everything that had come before: language, memory, cultural identity, and the determination to survive. Unlike enslaved people born in America, he had known freedom, family, culture, and land. He understood exactly what had been taken from him. That knowledge made his story different and more threatening to those who preferred to pretend the slave trade was a relic of the past rather than a crime that had happened in their own lifetimes. From the beginning, Cudjo and the other Clotilda captives stayed close to one another. They communicated in African languages, relied on one another for emotional support, and tried to preserve fragments of their identity in a world that sought to erase them. To survive, they learned English and adapted to the routines of plantation labor, but they never accepted enslavement as natural. Their memories became a powerful source of resilience, recalling who they had been before the ship, before the captivity, before the chains. Cudjo's early years in Alabama were marked by backbreaking labor, yet also by small acts of resistance and dignity. He refused to forget his name, speaking it softly to himself even as he used the one forced upon him. He developed friendships with the other survivors, particularly Gumpa, Abiel, and Kupale, forming a small community of people who understood the trauma of being taken from Africa. They taught each OT her survival strategies and shared stories of home, ensuring that the threads of their past remained unbroken. But the United States, on the eve of civil war, was a hostile place for enslaved Africans, especially those who had arrived illegally. The Clotilda captives were hidden from authorities, not as an act of protection, but as a way to shield the traffickers from prosecution. If federal agents had discovered them, Mayer and his associates could have faced severe punishment. Therefore, Cudjo and the others lived with an additional layer of fear. Their existence was a secret, and their voices were dangerous to their captors. They were property, but also evidence of a crime. Through all of this, Cudjo held on to memory with fierce determination. His recollections of Africa, his family, his traditions, his language became an internal sanctuary. Long after he could no longer walk freely in his homeland, he could revisit it in his mind. These memories would later become the source material for one of the most important first-hand accounts of the African slave trade ever recorded. Even before abolition, even before freedom, Cossola sensed that he carried something larger than himself, the final living memory of the last slave ship to reach America. He did not yet realize that decades later he would be the last surviving witness, the only voice left to speak for all who had been stolen with him. But the seeds of that legacy were planted in these early years, when survival meant remembering, and remembering meant preserving a truth that America would someday need, but many wished to forget. By the time freedom finally came, he had already endured a lifetime of loss, violence, and cultural erasure. Yet he emerged with his memories intact, resolute, and unwilling to let his story be buried. This is what makes Cudjo Lewis not merely a historical figure, but a guardian of truth. The last living link between Africa and the final chapter of the transatlantic slave trade. His journey from Oluwale Cossola to Cudjo Lewis is not only the story of one man, but the story America tried and failed to erase. The days that followed Cudjo's arrival in Alabama were a blur of exhaustion, terror, and a kind of numbness he had never felt in his life. He had known pain before. He had fought in battles, hunted in forests larger than any he would ever see again, and buried loved ones whose faces he still saw when he closed his eyes. But this new world, this land where the sky seemed too big and the ground too quiet, was pain of a different kind. It was the pain of being unrooted, of being torn from every memory that made a person whole. The captives had cried until their voices cracked. Now the quiet settled like a second chain on their shoulders. The men who owned the ship, and later the men who bought its human cargo, walked with a confidence that felt alien to the survivors. These were not warriors. They did not move with the respect that even rival tribes afforded one another. They strutted, barked orders, laughed loudly, and fought among themselves over coins, papers, and the value of the African standing before them. Cudjo watched their gestures closely, memorizing everything, how they pointed, how they threatened, how they held weapons. He knew that to survive, he needed to learn with the speed of a hunted animal. He had survived brutality before, but this was different. This was structure. These men had laws, systems, procedures. Their violence was organized. Their cruelty was clean, quiet, recorded in ledgers rather than in memory. It was the cold efficiency of people who believed they owned the right to another's breath. Cudjo could not understand their language, but he recognized the tone of men who saw profit where humanity should be. When he and the others were forced into pens, he could smell fear upon everyone, sharp and bitter, hanging in the humid air like smoke. Some of the youngest captives whimpered through the night. Others rocked back and forth, muttering prayers in their home languages. A few stared blankly ahead, their spirits already drifting somewhere beyond reach. But Cudjo held himself still. Every moment of stillness was an act of resistance. Every breath was a statement, "I am not broken yet." What kept him steady were the sounds in the dark, familiar syllables spoken in whispers. Survivors from different regions, different rights, different childhoods found ways to merge their languages, piecing together shared meaning. It was not home, but it was something like it, and in that something, a small spark of strength lived. They were eventually separated, sold, marched, and divided like livestock. Cudjo was brought to a plantation whose size made no sense to him. Rows of fields stretched so far he wondered if they reached the horizon itself. He had seen kingdoms before, but nothing that looked like this, an empire built on cotton, blood, and silence. The man who claimed ownership of him was not young nor particularly strong-looking, but he carried himself with a confidence that revealed everything about this world's power structure. He barely glanced at Cudjo's face when he handed him tools. To the man, he was no more interesting than the oxen tied to the posts. At first, every task felt like an ambush. The tools were odd shapes, some too heavy, some too blunt. The fields were different than the soil he knew, the plants foreign and stubborn. His body, accustomed to hunting, sudden sprints, and ritual movement, now had to adapt to the slow, repetitive grind of plantation labor. But Cudjo did what he always had. He watched. He studied the movements of others, copied their pace, learned the rhythm of the overseer's footsteps, and mastered each task quietly. The other enslaved workers noticed him, not only because he was newly arrived and still carried the posture of someone who remembered freedom, but because he did not crumble the way new arrivals often did. There was something in his eyes, a steady flame that refused to dim. One older man, who spoke a little of Cudjo's language, whispered to him one night, "Here, you must make your soul small, or they will crush it." Cudjo shook his head. "My soul cannot be small. Even if they take my name, even if they take the ground under me, I will still walk tall in my heart." The older man sighed, somewhere between admiration and sorrow. "Then they will fear you." And in time they did. Not because Cudjo rebelled openly. He was too strategic for that. Not because he was violent. His anger was never reckless. They feared him because he did not break, because he did not lose himself, because his presence reminded others that survival was not submission. He learned the patterns of the plantation. He understood the habits of the overseer, the sound of the bell, the way punishment was distributed, the conversations the enslaved whispered when night fell. He learned where the shadows stretched longest, where the dogs were kept, when the overseer grew impatient, when he grew tired. His silence became a source of tension for the overseers. They mistook it for defiance. In truth, it was strategy. Words could be dangerous here, silence was armor. And yet, in the stillness of his silence, Cudjo also listened. He learned fragments of English, repeating them under his breath, tasting each word, memorizing each phrase. He learned the rules, not just the spoken ones, but the invisible ones, carved into the movements of every person trapped on the land. There was a moment, months into his captivity, when he closed his eyes and tried to picture the faces of the other survivors from his village, but time had begun to erode the details. It scared him. So he forced himself to remember every face, every voice, every song. He built a home for them inside his mind, a place where none of this world's cruelty could reach. Still, nightmares came. Sometimes he woke before dawn drenched in sweat, his breath ragged, the echo of gunfire in his ears. Sometimes he woke hearing the screams from the raid that had torn him from his life. Sometimes he dreamed of running through his village, unable to reach his family in time. But when morning came, he rose like a warrior, quietly, steadily, with purpose. The enslaved workers began to gather around him, first out of curiosity, then out of respect. They saw how he lifted more than most men, how he carried himself with dignity even when the overseers barked at him. They saw how he refused to lower his eyes unless it served a purpose. In a world designed to strip people of their humanity, Cudjo projected a presence that reminded others of their own. When newcomers arrived, terrified, grieving, dazed from the trauma of capture and transport, Cudjo spoke to them quietly in whatever words he could. He offered guidance and gestures if language failed. He showed them how to survive the first weeks when despair hit hardest. He taught them how to read the dangers of the plantation, how to keep hope alive without drawing attention, how to hide their spirit in plain sight. His leadership was not loud, it was not confrontational, it was survival shared. One night, when the moon was only a thin silver blade in the sky, a woman approached him. She was small, quiet, her eyes deeply lined with exhaustion. She whispered, "They say you remember where you came from. They say you still hold your God in your chest." Cudjo nodded slowly. She asked, "How do you keep your heart from turning to stone?" He looked toward the distant trees, letting the wind run across his face before he answered. "Because I am still alive," he said softly, "and while I breathe, I am more than they can ever take." The woman exhaled shakily, as if releasing a weight she had carried too long. In that moment, Cudjo understood something profound. Survival here was not only physical, it was spiritual, cultural, emotional. To survive this world meant carrying memories like weapons, guarding them fiercely, never allowing them to be rewritten by those who wished to erase them. Months turned into over a year. Cudjo still felt the weight of captivity every day, but he also began forming relationships with the people around him. He joined in secret gatherings where the enslaved shared stories, whispered songs, and blended their traditions into something new, something born of pain but sustained by community. He found echoes of home in their drums, their chants, their dances, and he in turn offered them fragments of his own world. Stories of festivals, rituals, hunts, ancestors. They listened with awe, as though he carried a missing chapter of a book they had long forgotten existed. Yet even as he bonded with others, he longed for the day he could speak his own full language freely again. He longed for his village's laughter, for the smell of fires burning at night, for the sound of children racing through the tall grass. He longed for everything this world had taken, but beneath that longing was a flame of determination that never dimmed. One day he would tell his story. One day he would make sure the world knew that he had lived a life before captivity, and that his people had not vanished into the silence of history. For now he survived. He learned. He adapted. He became a quiet, unbreakable force moving through the fields of Alabama. And though the men who claim to own him would never admit it, they sensed there was something about him they could not fully control, something that would outlast them, something that would one day speak. The years passed slowly, each season dragging itself across Cudjo's life like a weighted chain. Yet with every cycle of planting and harvesting, he began to understand the deeper structure of the world he lived in, its dangers, its hidden networks, and the ways enslaved people carved out space for themselves within the cracks of oppression. He was surviving, yes, but something more was happening too. He was learning to navigate this new world not merely as a captive, but as a strategist. The plantation had its routines, all of them designed to condition obedience. Bells marked the start of labor. Whistles dictated pace. The crack of the overseer's whip was both a threat and an announcement. But within those rigid patterns, the enslaved people carved out their own silent systems of communication. Cudjo noticed this first in the fields. A woman to his left would hum a melody that changed whenever an overseer approached from behind. A man to his right would scratch the earth in faint lines that mapped escape routes or safe paths under the cover of night. Some workers walked slower at certain hours, not out of laziness, but because they knew the overseer's temper dropped as the sun set. Others took on heavier loads intentionally so a friend could take a moment's rest. Every action was a quiet rebellion, subtle enough to avoid punishment but strong enough to preserve dignity. Cudjo observed everything, but he also brought something they had never seen before, memories of a world untouched by slavery, stories of a place where his people had their own rules, traditions, justice, ceremonies, and leadership. To the enslaved born in America, who had no living memory of free African societies, Cudjo, stories were like water in a desert. Many nights, after the overseers retreated and the cabins dimmed to a hush, the enslaved gathered in whispers. They listened as Cudjo described his village, its music, its elders, its rituals. They listened to how disputes were settled, how marriages were celebrated, how children played without fear of chains or auctions. The older enslaved people listened with their eyes closed, imagining the world their grandparents must have known before being dragged across the ocean. The younger ones listened with quiet awe. They had never imagined a black world ruled by black people, a world that didn't exist in secret, a world where culture didn't need hiding. Cudjo's memories became a kind of treasure among them, but with that treasure came danger. The overseers noticed the gatherings. They noticed how people gravitated toward the newcomer with the steady gaze. They noticed how the group's spirit seemed to strengthen rather than weaken over time. Suspicion crept into their minds. One morning, an overseer approached Cudjo directly, eyeing him with a cold curiosity. "You ain't like the others," he said mockingly. "You walk different. You look a man in the eye. You carry yourself like you think you still somebody." Cudjo didn't understand every word, but he understood enough. The overseer expected fear, expected lowered eyes, expected submission. Cudjo simply held his silence. It was a silence that felt like a wall, a silence that angered the overseer. That day, Cudjo was watched more closely than ever. Every movement he made was judged, too slow, too fast, too proud, too quiet. But Cudjo had endured far worse threats. He adjusted just enough to avoid punishment, but not enough to betray his own spirit. It was a delicate balance, like walking along the edge of a blade. And slowly the others learned from him. Some began to stand a little straighter. Others began to speak with a little more confidence. A few even dared to look an overseer in the eye, only briefly, but enough to feel the electricity of reclaimed humanity. Still, Cudjo had no illusions. He knew freedom didn't come from posture alone. He needed knowledge, something more powerful than strength. And so he began to learn English with serious purpose. At first he listened to the overseer's arguments, memorizing the harshest words because they were repeated the most. Then he listened to the plantation owner, whose tone changed depending on whether he spoke to his family or his workers. He noticed patterns, which phrases indicated anger, which signaled carelessness, which suggested opportunity. He practiced alone at night, whispering to the dark, slow, and careful. Children laughed at his accent but also repeated words back to him, turning their cabin into a secret schoolroom. Women corrected him gently when he mispronounced things. Men shared whatever scraps of vocabulary they had overheard. Language became his weapon. The more he understood, the more he saw. The more he saw, the better he could strategize. English didn't erase his past. It sharpened his ability to protect it. One evening, as he hauled bundles of cotton toward the storage house, he overheard the plantation owner speaking to a neighbor. The tone was casual, careless, as though the two men were discussing crops rather than human beings. "New boy's strong," the owner said. "Smart too, but I'm watching him. Those Africans, they remember too much." The neighbor grunted. "Memory's dangerous. Born ones know their place. But those straight off the boat, they got the fire. You gotta break it early." The conversation chilled Cudjo more deeply than any punishment he had faced. Their goal wasn't merely control. It was erasure. A wiping away of history, identity, and self. They didn't just want labor from him. They wanted the forgetting of everything he was. That night, Cudjo sat alone outside his cabin, staring at the sky. He whispered in his own language, the syllables rolling like waves across his tongue. He prayed to the spirits of his ancestors. He asked them for strength, for patience, for guidance. He asked them to protect the people around him, people who were beginning to find hope in the memories he shared. He knew he had to hold firm. He knew his survival had meaning beyond himself. Weeks later, something happened that changed the rhythm of the entire plantation. A young boy, no older than 10, fell ill. Fever swept through him with terrifying speed. His mother wept as she held him, rocking him back and forth on the dirt floor of their cabin. The overseers shrugged coldly. Sickness was natural and the child was seen as replaceable. But Cudjo saw something different in the situation. In his village, healers used mixtures of herbs and leaves for fevers. He couldn't find all the ingredients in Alabama, but he had observed the plants near the riverbanks. Some resembled those from home. He asked permission to gather them, careful, respectful, using broken English. The overseer allowed it only because he assumed it would fail. That night, Cudjo prepared a mixture using the little knowledge he still carried from his homeland. He applied it with care, whispering prayers under his breath. The mother watched with hope and fear tangled in her eyes. By morning, the boy's fever broke. The plantation buzzed with whispers. Cudjo had done something neither overseer nor owner had managed, something rooted in knowledge older than this country itself. The enslaved began viewing him differently, not just as a strong man or a storyteller, but as a keeper of wisdom that connected them to origins they had been deprived of. But with a demurration came danger. The plantation owner summoned Cudjo. He stood in front of the large wooden house, its white columns gleaming in the sun. The owner leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "You cured the boy," he said slowly. "How?" Cudjo stayed silent for a long moment, choosing his words with care. "I learn in my home," he said in halting English. The owner narrowed his eyes. "You're not allowed to practice things I don't understand." Cudjo lowered his gaze, not out of submission, but to protect the fragile balance he was creating. "Yes, sir," he said softly, but he did not stop helping others. He simply became more discreet. People began coming to him at night, in pain, in grief, in secret. He offered herbs when he could, prayers when he could not, and courage always. His quiet strength became the heart of the community. Through him they remembered themselves. Through them he kept his own memories alive. And in these exchanges, whispered in the dark, hidden from the overseers, rooted in shared survival, the foundation of something far greater than courage began to form, the beginnings of a legacy. One day, long in the future, he would speak his story aloud for the world to hear. But in these early years in Alabama, the seeds of that future were planted in silence, in resilience, in the unbreakable human instinct to remember who you are, even when the world demands you forget. Cudjo was still enslaved, but his identity was not, and that truth, quiet, powerful, unyielding, traveled through the plantation like a pulse that could not be broken. The years continued their relentless march, and with each passing season, Cudjo found himself becoming not merely a survivor of bondage, but a carrier of something far more significant: memory. In a world determined to strip every man, woman, and child of their origins, he became a living archive, a vessel of stories, rituals, names, and truths that slavery sought to erase. And with every person who listened to him, a thread of that memory stretched into the future, refusing to be severed. But it was not only the enslaved who noticed his growing influence. The enslavers noticed too. Rumors traveled faster than the overseer's horses: a worker who healed fevers, a man who understood plants better than the plantation's own doctor, a foreigner whose languages and rituals made people whisper and gather in small circles after dark. Something about Cudjo unsettled the men who held power. Not because he was violent, but because he made others remember themselves. Memory was dangerous here. One evening, after the sun had dipped beneath the trees, an overseer approached him with a torch in hand and an expression that seemed tightened by suspicion. "You're making the others talk too much," he grumbled. "You keep their spirits up. That's not good for order." Cudjo could understand the tone, if not every word. The overseer's glare held an unspoken threat, a promise that surveillance was tightening around him. Prisoners in this land were not just controlled physically, their morale was policed. That night, Cudjo lay on the cabin floor, staring at the wooden ceiling. For the first time since arriving in America, fear spread through him like frost, not for himself, but for the people who sought him out for comfort, guidance, and healing. If the overseers decided he was a threat, the punishment would not fall on him alone. It would fall on anyone who dared believe in something beyond the plantation gates. Yet the more the enslavers tried to isolate him, the more people sought him out, because people need meaning to survive. One night, an older woman approached him, with tears streaming down her cheeks. She spoke in broken phrases, trying to explain that her daughter had been sold 3 days earlier. She had not eaten since. Her grief had become a second skin that suffocated her every breath. She asked him only one question: how do I keep living when my child is gone? Cudjo did not answer quickly. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder and let her cry. When she finally quieted, he spoke softly, his words shaped slowly, carefully, through a language still foreign to him. In my home, he whispered, when someone we love goes away, their spirits stay with us. We carry them here. He touched his chest, and we walk for them until they can walk again. The woman closed her eyes. Something in those words soothed the raw edges of her grief. She repeated them to herself throughout the night, and the next day, others approached Cudjo asking for the same reassurance. It was never his intention to become a leader, but leadership often finds those who do not seek it. His influence, however, also attracted hostility from those who benefited from silence. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and heavy above the fields, the plantation owner arrived on horseback. His expression was clipped and controlled, too controlled. He ordered everyone to the yard, overseers spread out, whips at their sides. The owner dismounted and began pacing slowly. I'm hearing reports, he said, his voice dangerously calm, that some of y'all been meeting after nightfall, talking too much, filling each other's heads with nonsense. The crowd fell silent. Cudjo bowed his head slightly. He already knew where this was leading. The owner's voice hardened. If any of you think you're going to stir rebellion, think again. I break rebellions before breakfast. He looked directly at Cudjo. And I'll break anyone who thinks he's a teacher around here. The overseer's eyes followed the owner's gaze. Some smirked. Others stiffened, sensing a shift in power dynamics. But Cudjo did not flinch. He stood as still as a carved statue, his expression unreadable. Inside, however, he was calculating. He could not afford defiance, but neither could he let fear show. His entire community watched him, drawing courage or despair from his every movement. Finally, the owner turned away. Back to work, he barked. The overseers lingered for a moment, watching Cudjo walk toward the fields. Their stares trailed after him like shadows. The warnings continued in subtle ways. A missing ration here, extra labor assigned there, a task deliberately made impossible. The plantation's cruelty tightened around him, not enough to break him physically, but enough to test the boundaries of his will. Despite all of this, the others still came to him. They came for stories. They came for comfort. They came for a reminder that they were more than the world's chains. And Cudjo kept speaking, quietly, carefully, strategically. He told them of festivals where dancers painted their bodies in bright colors, where drums vibrated through the ground like thunder. He told them of elders who spoke in proverbs, of children who chased goats through the fields, of marriages that lasted a lifetime. He shared the details not to make them mourn what they never had, but to show them that their existence had history, deep history, before America claimed ownership of their lives. Some nights he wondered if he was doing the right thing. What if sharing his memories caused more suffering than hope? What if giving people something to dream about made their present chains more unbearable? But the answers came from the people themselves. After one story, a young girl whispered, "When you talk, it feels like my heart remembers something it never knew. Anath." Said, "You make me want to live long enough to see something better." And then the most unexpected happened. The plantation's own doctor noticed him. The doctor, a thin man with spectacles and a voice always on the brink of irritation, had heard whispers about the African healer. He confronted Cudjo one afternoon outside the cabins. "You know plants," he said abruptly. "Show me." Cudjo hesitated. He did not trust this man, but refusing outright would create suspicion. So he followed the doctor to the edge of the fields where wild plants grew. The doctor pointed. "What's that?" Cudjo spoke the plant's name in his own language first, then explained, through gestures, broken English, and demonstrations, its uses. The doctor scribbled furiously in a notebook. He pointed to another plant, then another. Cudjo explained each one carefully. For the first time, Cudjo saw something unexpected in a white man's face when looking at him, not contempt, not suspicion, but curiosity. Still, curiosity was a double-edged sword. It could either grant space or take it away. The doctor brought him back several more times, asking questions, taking notes, testing small mixtures. None of this improved Cudjo's conditions. There were no rewards, no easing of labor, But something important shifted in the doctor's mind, the acknowledgement, however small, that Cudjo possessed knowledge no one here could ignore. But the overseers resented this. To them, Cudjo was becoming useful in ways they could not control. One evening, 2 overseers blocked him on the path back to his cabin. The sun had nearly set, and the trees cast long shadows across the dirt. "You think you something special?" one sneered. "You making folks look to you instead of us," the other added, stepping closer. "We the ones with authority here, not you." Cudjo said nothing. His silence deepened their frustration. The taller overseer pushed his chest hard. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Cudjo lifted his gaze slowly, not aggressively, not challengingly, but calmly, dangerously calmly. Something in his stare made both overseers pause. Not fear, but a realization this man's will was stronger than the chains on his wrists. They walked away without striking him, but the message was clear. Each passing day, the plantation became a battlefield not of guns or knives, but of influence, identity, and psychological survival. Violence was always a threat, but so too was the quieter war, the battle to keep one's spirit intact. Cudjo's presence altered the plantation in ways no one expected. Children began playing games that resembled the ones he described from his village. Women braided their hair in patterns inspired by his stories. Men whispered old African words he taught them, savoring the syllables like stolen treasures. Culture sprouted like wildflowers in the cracks of oppression. It terrified the overseers, because culture cannot be whipped away, because identity cannot be chained forever, because memory, once awakened, becomes a force more powerful than fear. And Cudjo, without raising a hand, without speaking loudly, without inciting rebellion, became the symbol of everything the system feared most. A man who remembered, a man who taught others to remember, a man whose identity refused to be erased. But these quiet victories came with their own cost. The more people relied on him, the more he felt the weight of responsibility. He was not merely surviving for himself anymore. He was surviving for everyone who looked to him as a bridge between a stolen past and an uncertain future, and that burden grew heavier each day. Still, he carried it, because he knew, deep in his heart, that the story of his people, of all enslaved people, could not end in silence. On E-Day, long after the fields had emptied and the voices of the oppressed began rising across the nation, someone would ask him to tell his story, and he would. But in these years, in these hard, brutal, unforgiving years, the story was still forming, still gathering strength, still building the foundation that would one day help him speak to the world. For now, he kept walking, kept remembering, kept living, kept resisting in the quietest, strongest ways, because every breath he took was a declaration, "I am still here." The final years of Cudjo Lewis's life were not marked by quiet disappearance, but by a powerful struggle to make the world remember what America tried to forget. He carried nearly a century of memory inside him, memory of a village burned to ash, the shadows of captors in the forest, the suffocating darkness of a slave ship hold, and the uneasy birth of Africatown. By the time the world finally came knocking at his door with cameras, pencils, and questions, Cudjo was not just a man, he was a living library whose pages had nearly been erased by time. But he was also tired. Age had wrapped itself around his bones like heavy rope, yet every time he spoke of Africa, his voice rose with the strength of a young warrior who had once run barefoot across Dahomian soil. During his later years, visitors found him seated outside his small wooden house, usually sharpening tools, weaving fish traps, or simply watching the tall grass sway in the Alabama heat. Children from Africatown often sat near him, listening as he repeated the stories he had spent decades protecting. Some adults teased him gently, calling him Cudjo the storyteller, but they also envied him, for he remembered home, he remembered a world before loss, he remembered what it meant to belong somewhere. His stories stitched the community together, giving the descendants of Clotilda survivors a sense of identity beyond the plantation fields that once held their parents and grandparents captive. But as the 20th century approached, the outside world began to finally realize who he was. Journalists, professors, and church leaders came seeking interviews. They brought notebooks, questions, and assumptions. Some treated him like an artifact, more museum piece than man. Others listened gently, recognizing the deep pain layered inside his memories. But no matter who came, Cudjo would begin the same way. "I am Kosola. They take my name, but they no take my soul." He insisted on telling the truth exactly as he remembered it, No apologies, no softening, no edits, and in doing so, he forced America to confront something it had long buried. One of the most important visitors was a young writer named Zora Neale Hurston, who traveled to see him in 1927. She found him not as a mysterious relic sitting silently in old age, but as a man full of humor, grief, stubborn dignity, and fire. When she asked him about Africa, he sat up straighter, eyes sharpening, as though transported instantly back in time. He told her about the festivals, the laughter, the drumming, the bright colors of his village, the training of young warriors, the rituals that welcomed boys into manhood. His voice cracked only when describing the night his village fell. The Dahomey warriors, the most feared in West Africa, stormed in with fire and steel. He described the screams, the smoke, the severed heads carried like trophies. "They kill my king," he said, clutching his chest. "They kill my brothers. They take me. I no see my family again." His eyes watered, not as an old man, but as the terrified 19-year-old boy he had once been. Hurston listened in silence, scribbling in her notebook while Cudjo cried. She wrote later that she had watched him weep like a child for the shore he would never see again. Yet, in between the grief, he also laughed. He told her stories of his youth, how he had been proud of his strength, how he had teased girls by jumping over streams, how he once stole fruit from a neighbor's tree and hid in the tall grass eating it with guilty delight. He wanted the world to know that before slavery, he had lived a full human life. He had dreams, parents, friends, ambitions. He had not been born into chains. After telling her about the horrors of the slave ship Clotilda, how they were kept naked, packed together so tightly that they could not move, fed just enough to live, punished for speaking their language, he paused and looked at her with an expression she said she never forgot. "I cry every day," he whispered, "because I no talk to anybody from my county. I lonely for Africa." That loneliness became the quiet core of his old age. Even as Africatown grew into a strong community, even as he became beloved by neighbors and church members, part of him remained anchored to a world across the ocean, a world he never stopped longing for. Yet the years that followed were not only painful. Cudjo found joy in small rituals. He tended a garden behind his house, growing yams and peanuts the way his mother had taught him. He carved canoes just as he had learned in Africa, shaping the wood with a rhythm that soothed him. And he told stories, so many stories that the younger generations began repeating them to their own children. That oral chain kept Africatown alive. Elders said Cudjo's voice was the heartbeat of the community. Still, tragedy continued to visit him. He outlived his wife, Abila, who had shared with him the burden of building a home from nothing. He buried several of his children, each lost chipping away at the faith he clung to, and he grew increasingly frustrated at how outsiders treated him. Some researchers came to him only for sensat, ional details, violence, slave ships, suffering, ignoring the deeper truths he tried to teach. Others twisted his words, publishing stories that made him seem more character than human. He once told a visitor, "I tell the truth, but they write lies." He feared that the world would turn his life into entertainment, not education. When Zora Neale Hurston returned to Alabama in 1928 to continue interviewing him, she found him in a quiet, reflective state. He told her he was tired of pretending that the world had improved. "They free us," he said, "but they no give us nothing." He recounted how, after emancipation, he and the other Clotilda survivors tried to save money to buy land. No one gave them help, not former slaveholders, not local officials, not businessmen. They built Africatown with their own hands, brick by brick, board by board. "We build our house," he told her, "because we want live like Africa people." He was proud of that. Even in old age, whenever he walked through the dusty paths of the settlement, he saw the echoes of Africa in the gardens, the huts, the laughter of children raised with stories of the homeland they had never seen. By the 1930s, more newspapers began publishing articles about him. Some treated him as a noble survivor, others sensationalized his African origins using racist caricatures and exaggerated descriptions. He sometimes refused interviews, telling neighbors he did not want to be displayed like a monkey in the zoo, but he would always talk to children. When a young boy or girl knocked on his door asking for a story, he would sit on the porch, lean forward and whisper, "Listen good, these words are all I have," and then he would speak about courage, survival, dignity, and the importance of remembering where you came from. As his body weakened, his memory remained sharp. Visitors recalled how his eyes lit up every time he spoke of Africa, how he moved his hands as though drawing maps in the air, how he described the forests, the rivers, the sounds of animals he had not heard in more than 70 years. He spoke less about slavery and more about life, what it meant to lose home and rebuild it, what it meant to have freedom but still feel displaced. Freedom is good, he once said, but freedom without home is a heavy thing. When Hurston completed her manuscript about him, Barracoon, publishers rejected it because she refused to rewrite his dialect into standard English. They told her that readers wouldn't accept his voice as it truly was. Hurston refused to betray him. His voice is his essence, she wrote. To erase it would be to erase him. The manuscript sat unpublished for nearly 90 years. Cudjo died in 1935, never knowing that his life story would eventually reach millions. In his final days, neighbors said he spoke often to people no one else could see. He would look into the distance and murmur in Yoruba, the language of his youth. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes tears streamed down his wrinkled cheeks. A few believed he was speaking to his ancestors. Others thought he was imagining his mother calling him home. One neighbor remembered hearing him whisper, "I see the river. I'm going home now." Those who cared for him said he left the world peacefully, his final breath a soft sigh, as if he had finally released the burden he had carried for almost a century. After his death, Africatown mourned him as though a king had passed. Hundreds gathered for his funeral. Children recited the stories he had taught them, adults sang hymns, and elders cried openly. His grave marker was simple, but the legacy he left behind was immense. He had not only survived the Middle Passage, he had preserved its truth. He had not only lived through slavery, he had built a community strong enough to outlast it. He had not only remembered Africa, he had kept it alive. Decades later, when Zora Neale Hurston's manuscript was finally published, readers around the world heard Cudjo's voice exactly as he had spoken it. His personality, funny, stubborn, proud, wounded, and deeply human, shone through every page. For the first time, millions saw him not as a symbol, but as a person, a boy stolen from his homeland, a man who endured horrific trauma, a survivor who rebuilt life with his own hands, a storyteller who refused to let history erase him. Today, Africatown still stands. Though time and industry have changed its landscape, signs of the original settlement remain. Descendants of the Clotilda, survivors still live there, still tell the stories passed down from Cudjo and the others, still fight to preserve their heritage, and researchers have now uncovered physical remains of the Clotilda ship, buried beneath river mud for more than a century, tangible proof of a story many once doubted. But perhaps the most powerful legacy is the one Cudjo carried in his heart, the simple truth that even the most brutal systems cannot extinguish identity, that memory itself is a form of resistance, that the past lives on in the stories we tell, and that one man's voice, preserved against all odds, can echo, louder than the silence forced upon generations. In the end, Cudjo Lewis died far from the land of his birth, but not without victory. He defeated the erasure that slavery sought to impose. He made America confront a chapter it preferred to ignore, and he ensured that the world would remember not only what was done to him, but who he was before it happened. Through his stories, he traveled back to Africa again and again, and through his legacy, he finally returned home.